Sometimes it's about context, sometimes it's about where you're from or how you understand it or your awareness of things. Some of you are perhaps wondering why I'm wearing exactly the same shirt I wore last week for Camping Sunday. This is not how I usually dress. And it's because it's red. And May the 5th is a day that it's suggested that people wear red in order to increase awareness of the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. So if you are not familiar with what's going on with that, you can find ever so much stuff on the internet. Just Google it. There's all sorts of information and news stories and things, and you should familiarize yourself with that. The thing about reconciliation is its power to address so many different things, and its power to change our awareness and understanding of so many different things and how we approach different things, including people. And it's not about where we go from here alone. It's about where we came from and acknowledging that and being aware of that too. So, let me tell you about a show on Netflix. I know what you're all immediately thinking, I don't do Netflix. He's going to talk about one of those shows again. Game of Thrones is on HBO, by the way. But there's a show on Netflix. If you don't have Netflix, when I tell you about this show, you'll probably want to get Netflix. It's called Queer Eye. And it's these 5 guys, and each of them has a role. One does fashion, one does hair, one does food, one does home, and the 5th one does culture. I think that's what they say it is. That's not exactly what he does, but these 5 guys go, and they basically do a makeover of somebody. I know what you're thinking, it's a makeover show. Just like home makeover shows, or those shows where, you do your hair and you're a different person. No, that actually isn't what happens. What happens is that they somehow fuse these 5 things together, and I think it's the 5th one, the 5th guy, the culture guy, because that's not exactly what he does. But they somehow fuse all of this stuff together, and they don't do a makeover in the traditional sense. They help that person become more of who they are and more aware of how to express who they are. It's really worth watching if you get a chance. And if you somehow manage to stumble across the one that's them doing a puppy, that was for fun. That's not a big deal. But it's really worth watching because you can see how change isn't the right word. That you can see how they transform somebody. And it's not about making them a different person. It's simply about helping them become more of who they are. And I think it's that 5th guy that really makes the whole thing come together. Because if you take that piece away and you just do what your hair's like, what your clothes are like, where you live, and what you eat, you missed something. And that 5th guy goes to who you are, what your fears are, where you came from, what you're all about. And when you put it together with all those other things, it helps a person become literally more of who they are. I know this sermon is going to seem a little bit like I went from something very serious to something a little bit, interesting, but and now I'm going to go back to something a little bit. The thing is, we always look at this story, I think, about Saul becoming Paul. I just said it the way we always look at it. Don't we? I mean, we hear this story about Saul, this guy on the road, the villain, right? He's persecuting followers of Jesus. He's the bad guy. And he's on the road to Damascus to get more. And he has a vision of Jesus, and he is changed, and he becomes this great apostle of Jesus who founds churches and creates community. And in fact, not only creates the community, then, because we have the letters that talk about it, he responds to the issues that they have in how they create community and helps them work through those things, right? Because that's what the epistles of Paul are, right? They're not directives from somebody. He's responding to what he's been hearing Whether he got a letter from them or somebody visited there and then saw him and went, hey, did you hear what was going on in Corinth? He wrote them letters to respond to things that are going on there, to help them work through that sense of community. So he didn't just kind of plant them and leave them. He helped them work through that stuff. But he never could have done that if he hadn't come from where he came from, is the thing. We tend to look at this story as this is one guy, Saul, and this is a new guy, Paul. Completely different guys. No, not. In fact, we do it that way, right? This one's Saul, and this one's Paul. And because we don't hear Saul called Paul until a little bit later, so we naturally assume he changed his name. No. Actually, there's a couple of references in the book of Acts to the fact that he was a Roman citizen. And whether that was actually true or not, he was from Tarsus, which was a very multicultural city, but part of the Roman Empire. It was near Greece. So it's entirely likely he would have had a, for lack of a better way of saying it, non-Jewish name. And that would have been Paul or Paulus. And he probably would have had that name from at least youth, if not birth. He was already Paul, in other words. And he was never not Saul after this experience with Jesus. It's not two different people. It's the same person. We all have things. Whether it's something we did or something that was done to us, we all have experiences in our life, some of which bring us great joy when we remember them, and some of them exactly the opposite. And pain and grief are really powerful things to want us to not go there again. But the thing is, if Paul had not been Saul, if he had not done those things, would Jesus have appeared to him? Would we have had somebody who went and then did all of these things? Now, whether he had a vision of Jesus or not, because in the story it says the people who were with him didn't see Jesus, or I think they heard the voice, but they didn't see the light. That's a really good metaphor right there. Heard the voice, but didn't see the light. But what happens after that is that he sees Ananias, and Ananias comes and he can see again. So again, there's the whole I was blind but cannot. Now I see. I was blind, but now I see. That's the line, right, from Amazing Grace? Right? And we know the story of the person who wrote that, John Newton, right? Famously became blind in later life, but wrote this hymn about how when he was younger, he was blind, but now he sees. Paul was blind, I guess, but now he sees. Except even that's too simplistic. That's too simplistic. Because if depending on your perspective on this story, Saul was a good Jew. In fact, he may have been driven to doing what he was doing because he was trying to protect the synagogue and the tradition that he lived from this new thing. They're not right. They're hurting what we're doing. Let's deal with that. You can almost see how he could get turned away and get lost in that. And get turned away from that part of his own tradition that said, love each other. We are one in spirit. There is one God for everybody. So he got a little bit lost. Okay, he got a lot lost in a big way. But then found his way. Has anybody not had that experience in their life at some point? See, it's not just about from here forward. It's about all of this stuff. And that's true for all of us. All of our experiences form who we are. It just it's how we bring those into our lives, right? They inform who we are, what we learn, the experiences that we have. Think of the people that had the experience of Jesus in all the stories we hear, these wonderful stories that focus on how Jesus did this, or Jesus did that, or Jesus did this. What about the other person in that story? What about that person in the story where Jesus said, "Go, your faith has made you well"? What happened to them? Did they go and share their experience of Jesus? Did they go and share their experience of what Jesus said as well? Or did they just kind of go, "Oh, my life's good now. From now on," right? How often do we do that? But that's not how it works. Right? We often, I know I said this before, but we often tend to look at our experiences as it's something in the past, get over it. Leave it there. Get over it. Move on. I can't think of what, there's many more ways of expressing that, I'm pretty sure. But get over it and move on are the two most significant ones, I think. And A, you don't. And B, you don't move on from stuff. You move on with stuff. Right? This is the thing. The experience that happens, you can't just kind of leave it in the past and go, "Oh, you'll get over it," and it's further in the past it gets, you'll forget it. No, you won't. Your life just expands around it. Right? It's not a question of that experience diminishes. It's a question of your life as you get older and you grow and as you move forward, your life gets bigger. You know this is true because if you've had an experience like that, where somebody at some point has said to you, get over it or move on, years later, something happens. It's something you see, hear, smell, any of the senses, and suddenly, bam, you're right there, and it's like it was yesterday or now even. It's not a moment that passes. It's a moment that stays with you because they all do. Saul, I feel like he should have a name that, let's call him Fred. He was not just the one piece of his life. He was all of his life. He carried all of that stuff with him. And it informed how he met people, how he addressed people, how he shared things with people. That even the experience of the transformation itself is something to share with people. It's not just about for Paul. It was not just about sharing with people. This is what Jesus teaches, and what Jesus teaches is this is how you'll know this person is a follower of Jesus, because they will love the way Jesus showed us to love. You'll also know they're a follower of Jesus because they won't just do that. They'll show you what it meant in their own life. And it becomes not just the stories of Jesus over here, it becomes the stories of Jesus in here. And that's what we start to live. This is the same guy, remember, who later on is going to talk about how we're all part of the same body. There is one spirit. All of those images of our connectedness and relationship. All of those images of how we are all unique and individual for who we are, but we're all valuable. We're all important. We're all loved. If Paul's saying that about how we should treat each other, don't you think that would be a good idea to treat ourselves that way too? I know that sounds like it's redundant because, after all, Jesus did say, "Love your neighbor as you love yourself," and so you obviously can't love your neighbor unless you love yourself already. Forgot that part, didn't we? Because it's easy to. But the experiences we have in our life are what help to form us, and we use them whether we're aware of it or not as we live forward. It's just how we do. which is why it's so important, particularly when it's something that's related to hurt and grief and pain. It's so important to share the story. That's a key part of reconciliation, too. It's a primary part of reconciliation, too. Sharing the story. We can't just kind of go, yeah, that was then, this is now, let's just kind of, because that's not how it works. We need to know the stories, and we need to hear the stories, because they, one way or another, empower how we go forward. So even when we hear, love one another as I have loved you, even in that is the experience of how did Jesus love us? How have we experienced the love of Jesus? How have we shared the love of Jesus? We are who we are. Saul, Paul, Fred, whatever you want to call him, he is who he is. And see, there's another really interesting thing too. It's not a was. As long as the story is alive, it's an is. As long as those stories, as long as those writings of this Paul, Saul, whatever his name was, as long as those writings are alive in us, as long as the story of Jesus is alive in us, it's an is. It's not a was. In fact, the more that's alive in us, the more it will be. Jesus is alive. It's the Easter season. Remember a few weeks ago we were Jesus is alive? Jesus is alive.